The quiet hum of the university library was the only sound Dr. Evelyn Reed truly registered, a familiar backdrop to her solitary world of forgotten histories. But on this particular evening, the stillness felt different, charged with an unspoken tension that resonated with the image glowing softly on her screen. It was an old photograph, pulled from a dusty, anonymous collection, acquired from a rural estate sale, a common enough find in her profession. Yet this one held her captive. It depicted three young women, Caucasian, likely in their late teens or early 20s, their dark hair pulled back in practical braids and modest buns, typical of early 20th century rural America. They wore simple, faded calico dresses, their forms stark against the weather-beaten planks of what appeared to be a rustic barn or farmhouse. Their expressions, at first glance, seemed serene, almost posed in a way that spoke of a bygone era's formality. But Evelyn, with her seasoned eye for nuance, felt a subtle discord, an underlying current of gravity that defied the pastoral setting. There was a quiet intensity in their gazes, a haunting stillness that went beyond the limitations of early photography. It was as if they held a secret, etched not just on the emulsion, but within their very souls, waiting for someone to finally see it. What chilling truth lies hidden in this innocent-looking photograph? How could a century-old image shatter our understanding of a forgotten era? Stay with us until the very end to uncover the astonishing revelation, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more untold stories. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching this from? The amber glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across Dr. Evelyn Reed's meticulous workspace, illuminating stacks of forgotten manuscripts and the gentle curve of her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch required for ancient texts and brittle documents, hovered over the keyboard. On the screen, a faded, sepia-toned photograph shimmered, pulled from a collection recently acquired by the university's historical archive. It was a common enough scene from early 20th century America. Three young women, all Caucasian, likely sisters, stood before the rough-hewn timbers of what appeared to be a family farmhouse. Their hair, dark and lustrous, was pulled back in utilitarian braids or coiled into neat, practical buns, free from the fuss of elaborate styling. Their simple, well-worn calico dresses, muted by time, spoke of lives intertwined with the land, of days spent in quiet labor under the vast American sky. At first, Evelyn saw nothing overtly remarkable. Their postures were straightforward, almost stiff, a testament to the long exposure times and the solemnity with which a portrait was approached in that era. Their faces, though clear, bore expressions that were hard to decipher, a blend of polite formality and perhaps a hint of youthful apprehension. Yet, as Evelyn allowed her gaze to linger, a peculiar feeling began to prickle at the edges of her academic detachment. There was an unspoken gravity in their eyes, a subtle dissonance that transcended the simple act of posing. It was as if a profound, unarticulated secret lay just beneath the surface of their composure. The eldest, standing slightly taller, held a quiet watchfulness. The middle sister possessed a softer, almost ethereal quality, while the youngest, though small, exuded a fragile resilience that tugged at Evelyn's professional curiosity. Evelyn, a meticulous historical archivist specializing in early American rural life, had seen countless images like this, snapshots of lives lived and forgotten. But this one possessed a quiet, almost haunting quality that resonated deep within her. It wasn't the striking beauty of a masterpiece, nor the dramatic intensity of a historical event. It was something far more subtle, a barely perceptible tremor in the fabric of the image that suggested a story unwritten, a truth unrevealed. The photograph seemed to hum with a silent energy, inviting her to look closer, to delve beyond the visible. And Evelyn, with a historian's insatiable hunger for the echoes of the past, found herself compelled to do just that, unaware that this seemingly innocuous image was about to pull her into a mystery far deeper and more unsettling than any she had encountered before. The following morning, the unsettling feeling from the photograph lingered with Evelyn. The quiet intensity in the women's eyes, the subtle discord she'd sensed, nagged at her professional curiosity. Her current project involved the high-resolution digital archiving of historical images, a painstaking process designed to preserve fragile artifacts and reveal details often lost to the naked eye. This particular photograph, with its intriguing yet unsettling quality, seemed a perfect candidate for advanced enhancement. Evelyn carefully placed the fragile print onto the specialized scanner, its delicate surface a century of silent witness. As the scanner whirred to life, she felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. The digital process began, transforming the faint sepia tones into a high-fidelity image on her monitor. She initiated the first round of enhancements, adjusting contrast, sharpening edges, and removing the pervasive digital noise that accumulates from age and environmental damage. The women's faces became clearer, their expressions slightly more defined, yet still holding that enigmatic quality. She began zooming in, systematically examining each detail, from the rough texture of the wooden barn to the intricate stitching on their simple garments. Her trained eye meticulously scanned for any unique historical markers, perhaps a forgotten tool, a distinct architectural feature, or a subtle emblem that might provide further context. For a long while, the process yielded only what she expected, the ordinary details of rural life in the early 20th century. The rough fabric of their dresses, the slightly worn soles of their boots, the weathered grain of the barn planks, all were as they should be. Then, as she pushed the magnification to its absolute limit, focusing on the exposed hands and wrists of the two outer women, a flicker caught her attention. It was so faint, so nearly imperceptible, that a less experienced archivist might have dismissed it as a digital artifact or a mere smudge on the original negative. But Evelyn's heart gave a sudden, almost imperceptible lurch. On the pale skin of their left wrists, just above the cuff of their sleeves, she saw it, a series of faint, irregular patterns. They weren't clearly defined, but they bore a chilling resemblance to faded scars, thin, jagged lines that seemed to have healed unevenly, or perhaps something even more unsettling, faint, almost ghostly, brand-like marks. The third woman, the one positioned in the center, appeared to have no such marks. This distinction only intensified the mystery. Why only two? And what could possibly cause such distinctive, uniform, yet irregular markings on the wrists of two young women in a seemingly idyllic rural portrait? The serenity of the photograph shattered, replaced by a cold wave of professional unease. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a puzzle, a silent witness to something deeply unusual. Evelyn leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration, her mind already racing with questions that demanded answers, questions that whispered of a hidden truth buried deep in the past. The faint, unsettling marks on the photograph refused to release their hold on Evelyn Reed. She felt an almost visceral need to understand them. Her routine archival work, once a methodical and predictable rhythm, had abruptly shifted into a frantic, focused quest. The anomalies were too distinct to ignore, too specific to be mere photographic imperfections. They were, she instinctively knew, a message from the past, a silent alarm bell. Her immediate priority was to anchor the image in a definitive historical context. She carefully flipped the brittle photograph over. On its reverse, inscribed in faded, spidery ink, were the words, "Millbrook, 1913, The Thompson Sisters, by S. Miller." The handwriting was faint, almost illegible, demanding meticulous effort to decipher, but the details once revealed were clear. Millbrook. The name resonated with a quaint pastoral simplicity, yet now it carried a new unsettling weight. Evelyn immediately plunged into the university's digital historical databases, cross-referencing Millbrook with the year 1913. Her searches quickly revealed a small, remarkably isolated agricultural community nestled deep in the American Midwest, far from major transportation routes or burgeoning urban centers. Millbrook was, by all accounts, a self-sufficient pocket of humanity, its existence barely registered in the broader historical narrative. Early 20th century census records confirmed its population was small, its inhabitants primarily farmers and their families. Land deeds and local tax records offered a mundane chronicle of property ownership and agricultural output. She meticulously searched for any mention of the Thompson sisters. The name was common enough, a frustrating reality when dealing with historical records. Hundreds of Thompsons appeared across the state, even within the same county, making it a dizzying task to pinpoint the correct family. She cross-referenced family names, birth dates, estimated from the women's apparent age in the photo, and geographic location, yet no definitive matches emerged that illuminated the sisters' specific fates, or any unusual events tied directly to them or their immediate family. The official narratives, the neatly bound ledgers, the crisp reports, the official correspondence, remained eerily, frustratingly silent. They spoke of harvests, births, deaths from common ailments, but absolutely nothing to explain the unsettling marks on the photograph or the subtle unease that had permeated Evelyn's thoughts since she first laid eyes on the image. It was as if Millbrook, despite its documented existence, had chosen to keep its deeper secrets, guarding them with a century of silence. Evelyn felt a growing sense of frustration, coupled with an even stronger conviction. If the answers weren't in the obvious places, they were hidden in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed. The silence of the official archives, far from deterring Evelyn, only intensified her resolve. It was a historian's instinct, a deep-seated belief that omissions often spoke louder than inclusions. If Millbrook, a community that clearly existed and hosted families like the Thompsons, was so sparsely documented, it suggested either extreme insignificance or, more chillingly, a deliberate erasure. Evelyn wasn't inclined to believe in insignificance when faced with such an unsettling photograph. She expanded her search parameters, moving beyond the obvious census and land records. She began sifting through less common sources, the marginalia of history often overlooked by others. She delved into county medical reports, not the official aggregated statistics, but the individual physician's notes, sometimes scribbled hastily in ledgers, never meant for public consumption. She combed through local church records, looking for unusual patterns in baptisms, marriages, or burials. She even requested access to private collections of correspondence from regional historical societies, hoping for any personal accounts that might shed light on Millbrook's isolated existence. Weeks blurred into a grueling cycle of reading, cross-referencing, and frustrating dead ends. Evelyn's eyes ached from the glare of the microfilm reader and the endless scroll of digital documents. Coffee became her constant companion, its bitterness a familiar counterpoint to the growing unease in her mind. Just as the weariness threatened to turn into despair, a faint flicker of possibility emerged. Deep within a dusty box of uncatalogued materials at the County Historical Society, tucked away amidst mundane agricultural pamphlets and outdated maps, Evelyn discovered a small collection of hand-bound notebooks. These weren't official documents, but personal journals kept by a circuit-riding doctor, Dr. Jeremiah Finch, who had served the remote areas of the state in the early 1900s. His entries, often terse and pragmatic, occasionally veered into personal observations and anxieties, painting a vivid, if disturbing, picture of life in the forgotten corners of the American Midwest. Her heart quickened as she began to read. Dr. Finch repeatedly referred to a peculiar affliction spreading through the most isolated settlements, including, chillingly, the Millbrook folk. His descriptions were unsettlingly consistent, a creeping malaise followed by persistent fevers unresponsive to conventional treatments. Then came the physical manifestations. He described unusual lesions and discolorations on the skin, often beginning on the extremities, before progressing to a strange, almost vacant look in the eyes of the afflicted. He also noted a disturbing pattern of unexplained disappearances, where individuals, particularly young women, would simply vanish from their homes, leaving behind only the chilling void of their absence. These were not the sterile, detached observations of a public health report. They were the raw, frightened notes of a man struggling against an unseen enemy, battling a phenomenon beyond his medical understanding. Dr. Finch's entries were filled with his own frustration and helplessness, hinting at a lack of resources and a pervasive fear that led to local communities often trying to conceal the full extent of their suffering. The official records, Evelyn now understood, were silent, not because nothing happened, but because the truth was too horrific, too unmanageable, or simply too distant to be properly documented or addressed by the sparse authorities of the time. Evelyn's gaze snapped back to the photograph of the Thompson sisters on her screen. The faint marks on the two women's wrists, once an enigma, now pulsed with a terrifying new significance. Were these the unusual lesions Dr. Finch had so desperately tried to understand? And what of the third sister, standing unmarked in the center? Evelyn felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The silence of the archives was breaking, but the whispers it released were far more terrifying than any noise. What desperate secret had the residents of Millbrook tried to bury, and what further horrors would Dr. Finch's forgotten words reveal about the fate of the Thompson sisters? The unsettling truth unearthed from Dr. Finch's journals solidified Evelyn's conviction. To truly understand the fate of the Thompson sisters and the tragedy that befell Millbrook, she had to go there. The sterile confines of the archive, while providing the initial clues, could never fully convey the atmosphere, the unspoken horrors, or the lingering echoes of such a profound loss. Logic dictated she continue her archival research, but a deeper, almost primal intuition, a historian's instinct, urged her towards the very ground where these events had unfolded. The journey itself became a slow, deliberate shedding of modern life. She packed a single backpack, eschewing comfort for necessity, field guides, a sturdy compass, a well-used camera, notebooks for observations, and, of course, the now deeply disturbing photograph of the Thompson sisters. Her route, meticulously planned using outdated county maps and Dr. Finch's scattered travel notes, began with paved roads that quickly dwindled to gravel, then to dusty, barely maintained farm tracks. The final stretch was a hike, guided only by the faded memory of a deer trail and the fading light of a late afternoon sun. With every mile she covered, the world seemed to peel away, layers of civilization dissolving behind her. The hum of distant traffic faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of unseen birds. The air grew thicker, cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient pines. This silence was not the benign quiet of a deserted library. It was a profound, almost oppressive stillness that seemed to absorb all sound, a silence that spoke of undisturbed secrets and long-forgotten whispers. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on her arms prickle, a quiet that seemed to hold its breath. Finally, guided by her GPS and the crumbling remnants of old fence posts, she reached what maps indicated as the location of Millbrook. The sight that greeted her was not merely disheartening, it was chilling. There was no village, not in any recognizable sense. Only the skeletal remains of what had once been buildings, crumbled stone foundations swallowed by moss, heaps of splintered, blackened timbers reclaimed by the earth, barely rising above the tangled undergrowth. Nature, with its relentless, indifferent force, had long since asserted its dominion. Towering trees, their roots snaking through the earth, stood sentinel where homes once bustled with life. Wild brambles and thorny bushes choked what might have been dirt roads, obliterating any clear path. It was as if the very memory of the village had been physically erased, dissolved into the wilderness, leaving behind only ghosts and fragments. Evelyn stood amidst this desolate expanse, a sudden piercing coldness seeping into her bones, unrelated to the crisp autumn air. She felt an overwhelming sense of presence, a silent testament to the lives that had once thrived here and to the tragedy that had wiped them from the map. She pulled out the photograph, comparing the faded image to the overgrown reality around her. Somewhere among these ruins, that rustic barn, that farmhouse, had stood. And somewhere on this very ground, a century ago, 3 young women had posed, their secret etched, not just on their wrists, but into the very soil beneath her feet. What had truly transpired in this forgotten hollow? The answers, she felt, were terrifyingly close, yet still elusive, hidden deep within the embrace of the ancient woods, waiting for her to dig further, to listen to the whispers of the wind through the skeletal trees. The raw primal silence of Millbrook, broken only by the whispers of the wind through skeletal trees, offered no further tangible clues. Evelyn had spent another day meticulously searching the ruins, her hands growing raw from digging through debris and sifting through decades of accumulated earth. The sheer force of nature's reclamation of the site was astonishing. What little remained of the village was fiercely guarded by tangles of thorny bushes and deeply embedded roots. She realized that the answers she sought were not to be found in the physical remnants of the past, but in its lingering memory. Her next step was clear. She needed to seek out the living echoes of that time. She returned to the nearest populated settlement, a small, unassuming town called Willow Creek, situated several miles away. Willow Creek, unlike Millbrook, had managed to survive, though it carried the quiet, slow pace of a community clinging to its last threads of history. The town boasted a dusty general store that smelled of wood smoke and aging spices, a small, whitewashed church with a leaning steeple, and a scattering of homes, many showing the wear of generations. Evelyn's arrival was met with the cautious curiosity typical of isolated rural communities. Strangers, especially those asking about forgotten places, were rare. She approached the oldest residents, those whose roots ran deepest into the area's soil, understanding that their memories, though perhaps fragmented and clouded by time, might hold the key. She spent her days at the general store, sipping weak coffee, patiently listening to local gossip, and gently steering conversations towards the past. She introduced herself as a historian, explaining her work on forgotten American communities, particularly focusing on the early 20th century. Her earnestness, combined with a quiet respect for their way of life, slowly began to chip away at their initial wariness. After several days of polite but non-committal conversations, Evelyn finally struck a vein. An elderly woman named Maeve O'Connell, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes a startling shade of clear blue, sat rocking on her porch, her gaze distant. Evelyn had been speaking of her interest in the local history, and Maeve, after a long silence, stirred. "Millbrook, you say?" Maeve's voice was a frail whisper, like dry leaves rustling. "Ah, my grandma used to tell tales about Millbrook. Said it was a cursed place. A strange affliction took hold there," she said. "People just faded away." Maeve's memories were fragmented, woven with the threads of folklore and superstition. But Evelyn clung to every word. Maeve spoke of the wasting sickness and the marked ones, mentioning how children were particularly susceptible. Her grandmother had warned her against ever going near Millbrook, citing stories of those who dared to venture there and either disappeared or returned changed, their eyes hollow, their spirits broken. Maeve recalled stories of blackened skin and unnatural quiet that descended upon the village. She even vaguely remembered her grandmother speaking of the Thompson sisters, though only in hushed tones, as if their names themselves carried a lingering sorrow. Another old man, Silas Croft, a retired farmer with calloused hands and a weathered face, added his own disjointed recollections. His grandfather, he claimed, had once seen a cart leaving Millbrook in the dead of night, laden with shrouded forms. Too many for such a small place, he'd always said, and not right-looking. These first-hand accounts, though embellished by generations of oral tradition and local fears, contained unmistakable echoes of Dr. Finch's dispassionate observations, the marked ones directly correlated with the lesions on the photograph. The wasting sickness aligned with the doctor's peculiar affliction. A cold certainty settled over Evelyn. These were not just old wives' tales. They were the distorted, terrified memories of a devastating reality. The pervasive fear surrounding Millbrook was palpable, even after a century. Why did the villagers fear it so? What chilling truth lay beneath these superstitions? And how did it connect to the strange marks on the Thompson sisters and the unsettling entries in Dr. Finch's forgotten journals? Evelyn thanked the old folks, her voice choked with a mix of gratitude and growing dread. She knew she was closer than ever to the truth, a truth that had haunted this remote corner of the Midwest for generations. The fragmented narratives from Willow Creek, though shrouded in superstition, provided Evelyn with a chilling confirmation. The wasting sickness, and the marked ones, were not merely folklore. They were distorted echoes of a very real, very tragic event. Armed with this renewed certainty and a profound sense of urgency, Evelyn returned to the desolate site of Millbrook. The ghostly silence that pervaded the overgrown ruins no longer felt merely oppressive. It felt expectant, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for her to uncover what had been buried. She spent days meticulously re-examining the site, but this time with a new purpose. She was no longer just looking for the general layout of a lost village. She was searching for a specific signature, a hidden clue that the fearful inhabitants might have left behind. Her focus narrowed to the largest, most defined foundation, the very one she had intuitively sensed was the farmhouse depicted in the photograph. This structure, she now believed, was not just a house, but a potential repository of forgotten truths. The ground was stubbornly unyielding, a century of fallen leaves, dense roots, and compacted soil. Evelyn worked tirelessly, her hands aching, her clothes stained with dirt and sweat. She used a small trowel and a stiff brush, patiently clearing away layers of time, meticulously inspecting every stone, every pocket of earth. The sun beat down and insects buzzed persistently, but Evelyn barely noticed. Her entire being was consumed by the methodical, almost ritualistic process of excavation. She was driven by an almost spiritual connection to the Thompson sisters, a silent promise to uncover their fate. And then, on the third day of her solitary vigil, amidst the debris of what would have been a crumbling cellar or root cellar, her trowel struck something unexpectedly solid. It wasn't rock or wood. It was a perfectly flat rectangular stone, clearly out of place amidst the rough, irregular rubble. It was heavy, and its surface was smooth on one side, suggesting it had been deliberately shaped. With a surge of adrenaline, Evelyn carefully pried it up. Beneath the stone, nestled in a small, expertly crafted niche, lined with smaller, flat river stones, lay a small bundle. It was tightly wrapped in what appeared to be heavy, tar-treated oilcloth, surprisingly resilient despite a century of burial. The protective wrapping had done its job. It had sealed the contents from the corrosive dampness and the ravages of time. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, a rapid drum against her ribs. She carefully peeled back the brittle, flaky oilcloth. Inside, nestled within, were several small leather-bound notebooks. Their covers were worn, their pages slightly discolored, but remarkably intact. As she gently opened the topmost journal, a faint, musty scent of aged paper and forgotten secrets filled the air. On the very first page, written in a clear, though slightly shaky hand, she saw a name, Elizabeth Thompson. A gasp escaped Evelyn's lips. Elizabeth, the eldest sister from the photograph, the one whose steady gaze had first drawn her in. She held in her hands not just old papers, but a direct personal testament from one of the women whose mystery had consumed her. A profound sense of awe, coupled with an almost overwhelming dread, washed over her. This was not a secondary source, filtered through official reports or local gossip. This was a direct voice from the grave, a personal narrative that had waited a century to be heard. With trembling fingers, Evelyn turned the page, ready to confront the horrifying truth that Elizabeth Thompson had meticulously recorded, a truth that had been buried not just under the earth, but under a century of silence. The silence of the forest around her now felt less expectant and more like a hushed reverence, as if even the ancient trees bent closer to listen. The musty scent of aged paper filled Evelyn's small tent, mingling with the crisp, cool air of the secluded woods. Her hand still trembling slightly from the sheer impact of her discovery. carefully turned the fragile pages of Elizabeth Thompson's journal. This was no dry historical account, no dispassionate observation. This was a raw, visceral cry from the past, a personal narrative of terror and loss, meticulously recorded by one of the very women she had been seeking. The early entries were deceptively mundane, notes on the rhythm of farm life, the fluctuating weather, the occasional joys of a harvest, or a rare visit from a traveling peddler. Elizabeth's hand, though neat, soon began to show signs of increasing distress, the lines becoming more hurried, sometimes smudged as if by tears or sweat. Then the narrative shifted, chillingly. Elizabeth began to describe the onset of a shadow that fell over Millbrook. It started subtly, with whispers, with the quiet suspicion that something was amiss. But soon the affliction began to manifest openly. She wrote of a strange wasting sickness that seemed to target the young women of the community, beginning with a creeping malaise, a profound and inexplicable weakness that drained their vitality. This was followed by a relentless, burning fever that no amount of cool compresses or herbal remedies could alleviate. Then came the horrifying physical manifestations. Elizabeth documented with chilling precision the appearance of the marks, initially small reddish spots that quickly escalated into deep weeping lesions. These sores, she wrote, seemed to burn from within, refusing to heal, often spreading and transforming the skin. Evelyn's breath hitched. These were undoubtedly the very same anomalies she had seen on the photograph, now rendered with terrifying clarity through Elizabeth's tormented words. The skin around these wounds, Elizabeth noted, would darken, becoming unnaturally tough and leathery, almost mummified in appearance. But the physical symptoms were only part of the horror. Elizabeth described a profound, almost spiritual change in the afflicted. Their faces would become distorted, their eyes, once vibrant, would grow clouded, developing a milky, almost sightless film, the white eyes that the old folks in Willow Creek had spoken of. More disturbing still was the alteration in their behavior. They became withdrawn, their spirits seemingly extinguished, their minds drifting into a vacant apathy. They would sit for hours, staring into space, responding only to the most direct commands, if at all. Elizabeth, it became clear from her detailed observations, was not merely a victim. She was a witness, and perhaps a caregiver. She chronicled her desperate attempts to help, to nurse her younger sisters, Sarah and Martha, who were among the first to succumb. She tried traditional remedies, local poultices, and prayers, but nothing worked. The sickness was relentless, mocking every effort. She described the agony of watching Sarah, her younger sister, wither away, her once bright spirit fading into the same blankness that consumed others. And then, the most terrifying detail, the afflicted, often in the dead of night, simply vanished. They would be there one evening, their breaths shallow and ragged, only for their beds to be empty by morning. No struggle, no signs of forced entry, just an inexplicable, terrifying absence. The journal's final entries were scrawled hastily, betraying a desperate urgency. Elizabeth expressed her own growing weakness, a familiar malaise creeping over her, and a chilling premonition that her time was also coming. She wrote of feeling the same shadow creeping towards her, of needing to prepare. The last words were a fragmented plea, a desperate hope that someone, someday, might find her words and understand what had happened. There was no explicit mention of her own fate, no final goodbye, but the abrupt end of the narrative spoke volumes. Evelyn slowly lowered the journal. Her hands were clammy, a cold dread seeping into her bones. This was more than a medical account. It was the raw, unvarnished truth of a community besieged by an incomprehensible horror. The seemingly serene faces in the photograph now stared at her with the tragic knowledge of their impending doom. What was this wasting sickness? A forgotten plague? A unique genetic curse that had systematically wiped out an entire community? And the disappearances? Were they truly inexplicable, or did they hint at an even darker, more sinister truth about Millbrook? Evelyn knew, with a terrifying certainty, that her journey into the past had just begun, and the answers she suspected would only lead to more unsettling questions. The words from Elizabeth Thompson's journal, stark and chilling, laid bare a historical horror that Evelyn could no longer grapple with alone. The vivid descriptions of the wasting sickness, the inexplicable weakness, the unrelenting fever, the disfiguring lesions, the vacant eyes, and especially the terrifying disappearances, demanded a deeper scientific analysis. This was no longer just a historical enigma, it was a medical one. Back in her university office, Evelyn meticulously organized her findings. She created a detailed timeline of symptoms as described by Elizabeth, cross-referencing them with the fragmented observations of Dr. Jeremiah Finch. She then reached out to two trusted colleagues, Dr. Arthur Finch, no relation to Jeremiah, but a distant cousin to the original, a fortunate coincidence that Evelyn found both ironic and fitting. A seasoned medical historian renowned for his work on forgotten epidemics, and Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant young geneticist with a keen interest in rare inherited disorders. Initially, both Arthur and Lena approached Evelyn's claims with a healthy dose of academic skepticism. Tales of mysterious illnesses and inexplicable disappearances often veered into the realm of folklore, not verifiable science. However, as Evelyn laid out her evidence, high-resolution digital scans of the photograph showing the distinct marks, direct quotes from Elizabeth's harrowing journal entries, and the corroborating, albeit vague, notes from Dr. Finch's personal medical logs, their skepticism began to wane, replaced by a growing fascination and unease. Dr. Arthur Finch, with his encyclopedic knowledge of historical diseases, noted the unusual combination of symptoms. The fever, the wasting, the lesions. It certainly has hallmarks of an infectious agent, perhaps a virulent bacterial strain or even a novel virus, he mused, his fingers tracing the enlarged images of the Thompson sisters' marked wrists. But the speed of progression, and especially the neurological changes, the vacant eyes, that's less typical for most common epidemics of the era, and the disappearances, that's the most perplexing aspect. He considered the isolation of Millbrook could have been a localized, self-contained outbreak that burned itself out once the host population was depleted. Dr. Lena Petrova, with her mind attuned to the intricacies of DNA, offered a different perspective. The specificity to young women, the gradual onset followed by rapid decline, and particularly the disfiguring skin lesions, these elements resonate with certain genetic metabolic disorders, or perhaps a rare autoimmune condition, she proposed, her brow furrowed in concentration. In a genetically isolated community like Millbrook, with potential for intermarriage, a recessive gene could easily become amplified, leading to a severe manifestation of a rare hereditary pathology. The body tries to cope, but eventually it collapses under the strain of its own genetic blueprint. She, too, however, struggled with the disappearances. Unless the cognitive decline was so severe, they simply wandered away, unable to navigate their way back. The three scientists spent hours, days even, in intense discussion, dissecting every word from Elizabeth's journal, every pixel of the photograph. They explored scenarios of environmental toxins unique to Millbrook's soil or water, ingested unwittingly. They discussed the possibility of a zoonotic disease transmitted from local animals to humans, perhaps through an insect vector. While no definitive answer emerged, they all agreed on one chilling conclusion. What happened in Millbrook was far from ordinary. It was not a common flu nor a typical case of scarlet fever or typhoid. This was a unique, devastating pathological event, a medical mystery demanding further investigation. The faint marks on the Thompson sisters' hands, once a mere anomaly, now screamed with the silent terror of an unprecedented affliction, a medical puzzle waiting to be solved. And the lingering question of the disappearances, the ultimate fate of the afflicted, continued to hang heavy in the air, a disturbing void in their evolving understanding. The intensity of the discussions with Dr. Finch and Dr. Petrova had left Evelyn both intellectually stimulated and emotionally drained. Their combined insights, though still hypothetical, painted a chilling picture of Millbrook's fate. They concluded that the village had likely succumbed to a contained but devastating health crisis. Dr. Finch leaned towards a virulent, localized epidemic, perhaps a unique strain of bacteria or virus that, once introduced, spread rapidly through the isolated community. He theorized that without modern sanitation, medical knowledge, or external intervention, such a pathogen could have easily decimated a small population. The fact that Millbrook eventually vanished entirely suggested that the disease either burned itself out by consuming all available hosts or became so lethal that the few survivors were forced to flee. Dr. Petrova, conversely, continued to advocate for the genetic hypothesis. She believed the isolation and probable intermarriage within Millbrook could have created a genetic bottleneck, amplifying a rare, lethal, recessive gene. This gene, she proposed, manifested in the wasting sickness, with its unique skin lesions and neurological decline. In this scenario, the disease was not contagious in the traditional sense, but an inherited vulnerability that, once triggered, perhaps by environmental factors or even simply age, led to the same devastating outcome. The marked ones were simply those whose genetic lottery had manifested the full, terrible expression of the inherited trait. Regardless of the precise etiology, both experts agreed on the tragic outcome. Millbrook experienced a catastrophic depopulation. The pervasive silence in official records, Evelyn now understood, was not merely an oversight. It was a multifaceted omission, perhaps born of a bureaucratic indifference to remote communities, a lack of resources to investigate such a devastating local crisis, or even a deliberate attempt to prevent widespread panic. In an era before rapid communication and robust public health infrastructure, a small, isolated village could simply vanish without a trace, its suffering unnoticed by the wider world. Millbrook was simply a forgotten casualty, a line erased from the map, its people absorbed into the vast, indifferent landscape. The photograph of the Thompson sisters, now pinned to Evelyn's corkboard, transformed into a haunting, undeniable testament. Sarah and Martha, with their spectral marks, were not just subjects of a historical image. They were silent victims of this unknown affliction, their lives cruelly cut short. And Elizabeth, standing between them, her gaze holding such profound sorrow and a chilling premonition, was the voice from the grave, the one who bore witness. The journal entries, once personal laments, now served as critical primary source material, corroborating the grim theories. Evelyn felt a deep, almost physical ache for these forgotten lives. The serenity of the pastoral scene in the photograph now felt like a cruel irony, a deceptive facade concealing unimaginable suffering. Millbrook wasn't just a place that ceased to exist. It was a wound in history left to fester in the shadows. The most chilling realization was the idea of the disappearances. Whether driven by delirious wandering, a desperate attempt to escape, or even the tragic outcome of a community burying its dead quickly and anonymously to prevent further spread or panic, the void left behind was palpable. The empty beds Elizabeth described were not merely a detail, they were the final, terrifying act of a forgotten catastrophe, leaving no one to tell the tale, and Evelyn, by sheer chance, had become the one to finally listen. The scientific theories surrounding Millbrook's demise, while plausible, did little to soothe the profound emotional impact Evelyn felt. The data, the analysis, the discussions, they were all crucial to understanding the mechanics of the tragedy, but they could not convey the raw human suffering embedded in Elizabeth Thompson's words. Evelyn would often find herself staring at the photograph, now a central piece of her research, no longer just an object of historical inquiry, but a silent, insistent testament to lives extinguished. The faces of Sarah and Martha, the two sisters with the chilling marks, spoke volumes. Their stillness, their seemingly placid expressions, now appeared not as serenity, but as the ominous calm before a storm, the terrible resignation of those consumed by an invisible enemy. And Elizabeth in the center, her gaze, so full of a knowing sorrow, had become more than just a subject in a picture. She was a voice, a witness, a desperate soul who had painstakingly recorded the unfolding horror, hoping, perhaps, that her words would someday break through the silence. Evelyn felt a deep, almost physical ache for these forgotten lives. She imagined their daily routines, their small joys and heartaches, their shared dreams of a future that never arrived. To think of an entire community, isolated and vulnerable, falling victim to such a merciless affliction, their plight unnoticed or simply ignored by the broader world, filled her with a chilling sense of injustice. The marks on the sisters' wrists were no longer just curious anomalies. They were visible scars of immense suffering, mute symbols of a battle fought and lost in the desolate quiet of the American Midwest. Her investigation, once a purely academic pursuit, had transformed into something far more profound, a mission to restore dignity and memory to those who had been systematically erased from history. Every fragile page of Elizabeth's journal, every hesitant whisper from the elders of Willow Creek, every medical hypothesis laid forth by her colleagues reinforced the terrifying scale of the catastrophe. It was not just a forgotten village, it was a devastating indictment of how easily human suffering can be ignored, especially when it occurs in the shadows, far from the eyes of power and progress. Evelyn realized that her task was not merely to solve a historical puzzle, but to give voice to the voiceless. The story of Millbrook was a potent reminder of the fragility of human existence in the face of the unknown, and the stark truth that civilization's reach, even in a supposedly modern age, had its severe limits. The silence that had shrouded Millbrook for a century was a testament to that neglect, a chilling echo of countless other untold stories lying dormant in forgotten archives across the nation. She knew that simply publishing her findings in a scholarly journal, while academically sound, would not be enough. The story of Millbrook, of the Thompson sisters, deserved to transcend academic circles. It needed to resonate with a wider audience, to serve as a cautionary tale, a poignant reminder that history often hides its most painful lessons in plain sight, waiting for someone to truly see. The weight of this unveiled truth settled heavily on Evelyn's shoulders, a powerful impetus to ensure that Elizabeth's desperate plea for remembrance would finally be answered. She was no longer just an archivist. She was a keeper of secrets, a restorer of dignity, and a messenger for the dead. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the true impact of this forgotten tragedy was only just beginning to be understood. Evelyn's published work on Millbrook had, as anticipated, ignited a fervent discussion within academic circles. Historians revisited their archives with new eyes, epidemiologists debated the nature of the wasting sickness, and geneticists pondered the implications of a potentially isolated, lethal genetic anomaly. The story of the Thompson sisters, once a forgotten footnote, now echoed in lecture halls and scholarly articles. Evelyn, weary but invigorated by the validation of her relentless pursuit of truth, found herself fielding countless inquiries, invitations to conferences, and requests for further collaboration. Yet, amidst the triumph, a subtle undercurrent of disquiet began to permeate her life. It started innocently enough, a series of anonymous emails, always from different, untraceable addresses, containing links to obscure, almost conspiratorial-looking online forums discussing unexplained longevity and human adaptation. Then came the veiled suggestions from unexpected sources, colleagues she barely knew or individuals who approached her after public lectures, hinting that her research might be touching upon something far grander than a mere historical epidemic. These interactions were always fleeting, the individuals dissolving into the crowd before she could press for details. The most unnerving manifestation of this subtle pressure came in the form of a heavily encrypted message, delivered not digitally but physically. It was a single, unmarked envelope left anonymously in her university mailbox. Inside, a flash drive, devoid of any identifying marks. Hesitantly, Evelyn plugged it into an isolated, secure computer. The drive contained a single looping video. It was a distorted, grainy recording, seemingly from an old surveillance camera, showing blurry figures moving with impossible speed and grace, performing feats that defied known human physiology. Interspersed with these unsettling clips were snippets of what looked like scientific data, complex genetic sequences, neurological scans showing unusual brain activity, and, most chillingly, medical records detailing cases of rapid healing and slowed aging. There was no narration, no explanation, only the unsettling visual evidence. Then the video paused on a stark black screen. White text, stark and unblinking, appeared. Your work on Millbrook has revealed part of the truth. There are other stories, other populations. You have identified the symptoms. We invite you to understand the cause. Your research is nearing a critical juncture. Do you wish to see what lies beyond the historical? Evelyn stared at the screen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The implications were staggering, stretching far beyond the confines of historical research or even modern epidemiology. This wasn't about a forgotten plague or a genetic anomaly within a single, isolated community. This felt like a deliberate, controlled revelation. The disappearances from Millbrook, the unexplainable vanishing of the afflicted, what if they weren't simply deaths in the wilderness, but something else entirely? What if they were transformations? The image of the three Thompson sisters on her corkboard seemed to gain a new, terrifying dimension. Were those marks on Sarah and Martha not just symptoms of decline but signs of a change? And Elizabeth, the central figure, the one without marks, who penned the journal, what was her true role? Had she simply documented a tragedy, or had she been a witness to something far more profound, something that defied the very definition of human existence? The line between the known and the unknown, between history and something utterly unprecedented, had just blurred into an unsettling continuum. Evelyn knew she was at a precipice, facing a choice that would redefine not only her understanding of Millbrook, but perhaps the very nature of humanity itself. The silent invitation hung in the air, pulling her towards a truth far more dangerous and world-altering than she could have ever imagined. The encrypted flash drive pulsed with an unsettling, silent invitation, its contents searing into Evelyn's mind. The grainy footage of impossible human feats, the strange medical data. It all pointed to a truth far grander and more terrifying than a forgotten epidemic or a genetic anomaly. The historical mystery of Millbrook, the wasting sickness, the inexplicable disappearances, now seemed like mere fragments of a much larger global tapestry. Evelyn found herself in a vortex of profound disbelief and horrifying realization. The very fabric of her understanding, meticulously woven from historical facts and scientific principles, was unraveling. The marks on Sarah and Martha, the symptoms of the illness, the way the afflicted simply vanished. They weren't signs of decay, but of a monstrous, breathtaking transformation. The white eyes that the old villagers whispered about, the vacant stares Elizabeth described, were not the dullness of death, but perhaps the cold, unfeeling clarity of something newly awakened within. Her mind raced back to the original photograph. Elizabeth, standing in the center, unmarked, her face a canvas of sorrow and knowing. What was her role? Had she simply borne witness, or had she been spared, perhaps even chosen, for a different purpose? The journals she meticulously hid, the plea for someone to understand. Was it a cry for help for a lost community, or a desperate attempt to record a phenomenon too vast for the world to comprehend? The implication was terrifying. The disappearances from Millbrook were not deaths. They were convergences. The afflicted weren't dying. They were changing, evolving into something beyond conventional humanity. And those changes, those marks, were merely the visible signs of an internal metamorphosis. As Evelyn stared at the final stark text on the screen, a new wave of information began to scroll, seemingly triggered by her silence. It was a data stream, rapid and overwhelming, displaying statistics and protocols. The words solidified her darkest fears, shattering any lingering illusions of a simple historical tragedy. Project Aeon, Activation Phase 3, Population 0.7% carriers, global integration in 6 months. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Project Aeon. Not a natural phenomenon, but a planned, deliberate endeavor. A project. And carriers. The term resonated with a chilling familiarity, linking directly to the unknown illness of Millbrook. The wasting sickness was not just a historical anomaly, it was the genesis, the first observed manifestation of a process that had been quietly unfolding for a century. The disappearances were not victims consumed by the wilderness. They were the earliest subjects of this evolution, meticulously collected perhaps for study or integration. The revelation was staggering in its scope. Millbrook was not an isolated incident. It was a blueprint. The disease was a catalyst. And now the carriers were almost 1% of the global population. They were among us, hidden in plain sight, their unique physiology allowing them to blend seamlessly into society. Her neighbors, her friends, even herself. Anyone could be a carrier, unknowingly part of this monumental silent shift. Evelyn looked around her quiet office, the familiar books and archives suddenly imbued with a sinister new meaning. How many faces in those old photographs, how many forgotten names, harbored this secret? How many passed unnoticed through history, their unique nature hidden beneath the veil of normalcy? The very definition of human existence was being redefined, not by some cataclysmic event, but by a quiet, insidious evolution that had been initiated a century ago, perhaps even with the very women she had been studying. The final words of the data stream faded, leaving Evelyn in a profound, terrifying silence. She had stumbled upon a truth that went far beyond the dust of archives and the whispers of forgotten villages. She had unveiled a secret that threatened to redefine humanity itself. The past had reached into the present, and it was not just a memory, but a living, breathing, evolving force. And the most unsettling question of all lingered in the air, a cold breath against her skin. How many old photographs did the world hold, images of faces that were not quite human, watching, waiting, evolving right under our very noses? The project had already begun, and its true reach remained terrifyingly unknown.